As for me, how did I get here? I'm not a filmmaker, and some of you may know from last year's ethics panel, I'm a psychotherapist. And the reason that I'm interested in environmental ethics is that in my work as a psychotherapist, and in my own healing process, my journey through life, it's become very clear to me that without a natural world, we are doomed as the species we think we'd like to be. We have lost our spirits. We have physical disease. We have emotional illness because we have lost our connection with nature. And so for me, the fate of our human species depends completely on the well-being of the natural world. Without it, we're not going to be the people that we think we are or would like to be. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Game did a movie several years ago that won an award here at the film festival called The Last Parable. And I have to paraphrase the sentence from that script that had meaning to me, but it went something like, the longer we live, the farther we travel from who we think we are. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And one of the strangest paradoxes to me about human nature is that the farther we get removed from wilderness and nature in the natural sense, the wilder we become. And I say that because I looked up a lot of words in the dictionary last summer, good old Webster's Collegiate, and words like natural are related to being foolish and an idiot and crazy. Look up Webster's. Look up the word wild in the dictionary. It relates to insanity. And I think there's a real paradox there. What is wild? And why do we seek to tame it and dominate it? And what happens to us when we do that? Just thoughts to ponder.
Spending a large portion of my life in North America's wild places, I have observed and experienced situations that question the sensitivity and respect, oh, here it is, that we have for these special places and their inhabitants. There's no doubt in my mind that the quest for wilderness and wildlife viewing is on the increase. And not only do I see those changes in Montana with the development of a cooperative wildlife viewing program by the Defenders of Wildlife in conjunction with Montana's Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Park, I see even more of a drastic change in a state where I have sought refuge the last several years, Alaska. Alaska's Katmai National Park is a perfect example of the change that is occurring from a consumptive to a non-consumptive use of wildlife, bear watching. In the last 5 years, the increase in visitors has been from 10,000 to 50,000 at Brooks Camp alone. Traditionally, Brooks Camp has been a fishing mecca. Now, the guests are not only armed with fishing rods, but with 400mm lenses. And this new guest is now in the pursuit of a glossy full-frame print. Can the bear adapt to this change, this new visitor? In my observations, it is real clear that the fisherman and the bear have developed a relationship which has evolved over time. However, a new relationship is needed. Are we patient enough to give the bear time to develop this relationship he or she deserves? Will we place more pressures on an already stressed situation for a short-term gain, the photo, when the long-term fate of the bear is survival? Unfortunately, during my last visit to Brooks Camp, it was real clear that the visitors were more concerned about their own needs than the needs of the subject, the bear.
I remember during that summer of 1957, I was on duty on the 4th of July, the big day in any national park. In fact, I was the only person on duty. The rest of the park staff had all gone out into the park to look at wildlife. During that day, I checked in 4 cars. 4 people arrived in McKinley Park on the 4th of July, 1957. In 1958, the new dirt road was punched through from Paxson, which was the first connection of McKinley Park to the outside road system. That next year, 1958, we had something like 800 cars on the 4th of July, and we had wildlife photographers everywhere. Lenses blossomed like mushrooms all over the place, professional and amateur. And they were all people who were in a hurry. They were coming from Anchorage or Fairbanks, and it was a terrible drive over bad roads. They had only a weekend or only a few days, and so they had to tear in, get their pictures, do their footage, and get out. The park changed. Where we had always, invariably seen bears at Sable Pass, now we began to see them only rarely. Where we had seen caribou migrations on the thoroughfare bar of hundreds of thousands of animals, we now saw scattered animals, and the migration pattern never had its integrity after that. And there were incidents. People began to tangle with bears, of course. Fox dens were violated. Eagles' nests were disturbed. And the result was that the Park Service instituted regulations. Sable Pass was closed. That 5-mile stretch was closed so that photographers and others could no longer get out of their cars. That proved not to be enough. What has happened now is that cars are banned, essentially, from the road in Denali Park, and all visitors have to go on buses. That's just an example of how we get into developing codes of regulations and conduct and ethics, regulations mostly. We do it because we have to defend what we care about from ourselves. Another little item we've learned that is part of a new story is that the Earth is alive. I'm thinking of the work of James Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis, which keeps being affirmed by new studies and becomes ever more intricate every day. It is not a woo-woo story about some goddess who is pulling the strings of the world. It is a very hard-headed biochemical story of how the life forms of the Earth regulate the chemical composition of the atmosphere and of the water on the planet. And it's a pattern of the interaction of sunlight and living organisms that produces a planet that is itself a living organism, a system of life that operates on the same basis that our systems of life do. We're sitting here regulating our temperature, we're regulating the chemistry of our bodies. That is what our bodies do for us. The same thing happens on the level of the planet as a whole, and at many intermediate levels. So the Earth is no longer merely an object. We cannot think of it as a thing any longer. We need to view it as we view one another, as a living organism that has its own integrity, its own character, and it's a rare character. As far as we can look, we don't find other organisms like this planet anywhere out there. So we've got an uncommon circumstance here, an Earth that is alive. And finding out how to relate to it is a new task for us. Finding the language with which to interact with that Earth is a responsibility we all have. We have heard for a long time that one of our tasks on that Earth, and one of the tasks of every creature, those of us who've studied ecology and things, we have heard that what we must do is adapt to our environments. Adaptation to environment is one of the ecological imperatives that we have been hearing from the environmental movement and from our scientific ecology for a long time. One of the new things we've learned is that adaptation is nonsense. It can't be done. Why? Because the environment is not a static thing. The environment is a growing, moving, changing organism. Everything in that environment is changing its pattern of behavior in response to everything else in that environment. So it isn't a question of adapting to some given thing, adapting to an environment. What we see is rather a dance where all the components of life are relating to one another in extraordinarily complex, dynamic ways. And dance is probably the best way to describe it. Is a dance an adaptation? Is a dance the way one partner adapts to the other? It's a way they establish a dynamic, moving relationship that changes every moment. That's the kind of relationship we're in to our natural environment. It's not adapting to some inert thing out there. Adaptation simply is not part of the picture. Ethics let's get back to ethics, since that's what we're supposed to be talking about. I don't think ethics depend upon words or codes of conduct. I don't think rules are ever going to determine our ethical relationship to nature. I think the most important thing that determines our relationship to nature is our perception. What we see in the natural world determines how we behave in relationship to that world. And the flaws are not in our rules and regulations. The flaws are in our own perceptions, our senses, the way we see and touch and feel and hear and smell the world, and the way we interpret those things. This has always been true of us. We have misused things that we have failed to perceive in their context. Just a simple example that we all know about. When the settlers came to the American West, what they perceived were wild animals called Indians. And all the imagery of that frontier period is one that connects the Indian and the buffalo and exterminates them both. But what the settlers saw were not human beings, but wild animals. And they treated the Indian and the buffalo basically the same. In our history, we've done exactly the same thing with black races. The blacks have been seen as domesticated animals. And if you look at all the imagery of whites describing black people, it's an imagery that is derived from the farm and from domestication. Beasts of burden, brutes, control their food, control their sexuality, and they'll love you. All of the things that farmers say about their cattle are the things that slave owners said about their slaves, and they're the things the things that white settlers said about the Indian populations were all derived from their experience of wild animals. You kill them, you use them, you go to war with them, and your job is to control them and manage them. I want to conclude with an aspect of the comedy of this situation. You see, what this implies is that we are in a game and that we are players in that game. And so we need to know what the rules of the game are. A fellow who's helped me a lot recently is a man named James Carse, who's written a book called Finite and Infinite Games. There are only two kinds of games in the world, finite and infinite games. A finite game is one that is played for the purpose of winning. In fact, the purpose of a finite game is to bring the game to an end. That's why you play a game, is to bring it to the end. And most sports are that way, most politics is that way, all war is that way, and all tragic stories are that way. The purpose is to make a decision and bring the game to an end. Infinite games are the ones that are played for the purpose of keeping the game going. One example of the difference between a finite and an infinite game is in the male-female relationship. In a sexual game, if it's played in a finite way, the prize for the winner is the loser, if it's a finite game. If it's an infinite game, there's no winner and there's no loser, and the game goes on. That's the object of the infinite game of relationships between males and females. Well, the infinite game story is the new story that we're in. No more finite games, no more winners, no more losers. The trick is to play the game in such a way as to keep the whole game going as long as possible, to keep it going forever. And you know, evolution is an infinite game. Ecology is an infinite game. Comedy is an infinite game. Our individual lives are infinite games. And that's the task, to find the rules that will assure that the game will never end, and that we, all of us, human and non-humans alike, can participate in the game fully and participate together in it. So the best thing I hope for all of us, I think, is a batch of brand new comic films that portray nature as the infinite game that it really is. Thank you.
I would like to see the day when a photographer is injured in a park and the title of the article is "Marauding Photographer Injured by Bear Defending Territory." That's what we need more of. Bears do not attack people. Animals do not attack people. They defend their young, they defend their territory, and they defend their food supply. We are the marauders. We are the ones that have left our neighborhoods in our area to maraud through the parks to gather up our pictures, our footage, our wildlife experience. So it's our responsibility to behave in an ethical fashion. And it's also our responsibility to convey that message to whoever else we can. I'm a strong believer in givebacks. I owe the wildlife something. I owe them a certain portion of my time every year to help educate the general public.
One of the things that's bothering me more and more is the use of captive animals. I think that anybody who's worked in this business realizes that there are some animals that are best filmed in a captive situation. If you're trying to portray a habitat or an ecological system, there are certain critters in there that you could spend the rest of your life crawling around on hands and knees and maybe never even see, let alone film. So you're really, the only way you're going to do that is through a captive situation. And there's an ethics involved there, first of all, biologically, in that what we portray while doing something like this has got to be biologically accurate. I've seen shows on the television that are still pictures whereby there are two critters that would never encounter each other because of geography, or one might be diurnal and nocturnal, and yet they're portrayed as encountering each other on a regular basis. So I think anything that is done in a captive situation has to be done with great care as to accuracy. I think that beyond that, using captive animals, there are people now, because of varying reasons, using big animals which are available in the wild, which they're getting from rent-a-critter shops. And because of budget or because of length of time they have to put in, they're using these animals. And I won't judge that one way or another, but there comes to the next step whereby one of the things that the public, producers, and everybody else wants to see is situations where there's predator and prey interaction. And a lot of this is set up in a captive situation. And the question that Jeffrey Boswell, who's a British chap who's been involved in film at different levels for years in Bath, in a similar discussion, he was trying to make it to draw some line as to where you stopped when you were doing predator-prey setup situations. And the analogy he used, which I think is excellent, is he said, well, do you feed a fly to a lizard? Is that okay? Do you feed a lizard to a snake? Do you feed a snowshoe hare to a lynx? Do you feed a deer to a mountain lion? Do you feed a second grader to a crocodile? I mean, where do you draw the line? I think that we should put out some feeling on this.
Variety of lies that were perfectly accepted views of the natural world, and one of them was that animals are imitations of humans, either kind of nice ones or pretty inferior ones, like insects dancing to human music. That was the Disney presentation in the late 50s. Or nice ones, animals being attractive because they share human and can be understood through human feelings and human characteristics, and that a dog is smiling, and that a warbler sings the songs of love. And what kind of image of a warbler's life or world you're giving when you use the word love? I mean, it isn't a word I would use because it implies a huge human series of assumptions, which is dicey to apply to a warbler, but I mean, it's worth thinking about because I did hear it just recently. Animals, and this is a more sophisticated vision of the world that I've seen and indeed myself, is an animal as kind of other races to be studied, to be looked at and understood And in order not to be racist about them, the better you understand another race, the less you criticize them for the way they eat or whatever.
How can we tell stories and not expect other people to want to recreate those stories for themselves? And this is sort of the crux of the nature photography business, whether it's cinema or still photography. If we're presenting an image of nature that is so glamorous and so stunning, which is what we at Ottoman Magazine strive to do to some extent, and set a standard of excellence in photography, then how can we not expect everyone else to want to go out and recreate that same standard of excellence? And this is something that we are all going to have to deal with here. And I don't know what conclusions we can draw, but obviously our whole concept of how we value nature is changing, and how we're going to present nature, whether it's in verbal form or script form or television form or still photography form. We have to look at our whole underlying value system and decide what are the right modes of behavior. Are we going to give animals more due? Are they going to have more rights in this equation? Are we going to continue to try and glamorize? Are we going to, perhaps something like Audubon Magazine, something that's been puzzling me, is if we're going to get away from the animal portrait, the rented animal, which I really find obnoxious personally as a method of gaining an image. If we're going to get away from that, then maybe are we going to be expected to lower our standards photographically? Are we going to require more distance? Are we going to require more blurred images? Are we going to require something that's less than perfect as a photograph because perhaps it's more authentic as an experience for somebody looking at that photograph? And can we go backwards if it is indeed going backwards? Can we rethink how we present nature when we've been so spoiled by the excellence of everything that we've seen? I mean, we have these very, very high expectations of nature up close. And if we're asking ourselves to distance ourselves from nature, what then do we do with those images that are up close? Aren't they a sort of false presentation?
So I think as we start thinking about ethics and what's happening, the other thing that happened for me is that being in the field over a long period of time in the last 10 years and starting out, one as a beginner, as the new kid on the block, and two, being a woman on the new kid on the block, which is an industry largely dominated by males, I was very tentative about being there, whether I belonged there, how I could compete, what I could say, what I could do, what I could shoot. And I started seeing things in the field that I couldn't believe I was seeing. And then I started hearing things about other photographers, and I started thinking about, do I really want to compete in this way with these people for these images? If it means I'm throwing rocks, displacing, baiting, feeding, do I want to be a wildlife photographer? Do I want to be a landscape photographer? And we've been talking a lot about animals. We've left out habitat, you know. As a workshop leader, do I take a group of people to photograph showy lady slippers in northern Wisconsin? Do I want them to walk on the plants that they can't see? Do I want them to know where they are and go back and dig them up and take them to the yard? The answer is no. I can do a lot for myself as a tour leader and gain a reputation for taking people to see things that are wild and rare and special, but I can't live with myself in the middle of the night when I do that. Those kinds of questions, you know, we have to continue to address, and those things I started to see in the field caused me to believe that one of the best impacts that I could have was by communicating some kind of ethic to the people that I was teaching, which is also a way to be in the world. And you can't legislate that. We can't come up with a code of ethics out of this workshop. and send it out and say, this is what you have to do. But I can tell you this, if we don't start to police ourselves as a group and as the role models, the agencies are going to do it for us. Because we as photographers are starting to cause enough problems in the national parks, the forests, the wild areas, that they're starting to have to make regulations. And then it's not just us, then what happens to the unwashed masses, if you will, you know, who look to our photography on the cover of Audubon as the example that they want to recreate and they want to do. And the final thing I want to say is that the much larger issue here is why we as a culture photograph. And the fact that for many, many people, the photograph has become the validation of the experience. And that they can't experience what's out there just for the sake that it's wonderful. They have to have the end product, which is to take back to Hoboken and say, I did it, I saw it. It's proof of purchase, if you will.
You'll have to indulge me a little bit because I'm reeling from the 4 sets of comments here. And if you'll also indulge me a minute too, I think it's appropriate to talk a little bit about not just the Park Service's role in this discussion here in the forum, but perhaps as an area where the subjects are, whether it be the plants or the animals, what the value is and where we've been and where we're going and how we maybe fit into that new picture, that new story. My role is relatively new at Glacier National Park. I work with the media and the filmers and other special interests, and it's a challenge and it's an exciting one. There are a few of those positions in the National Park Service as a rule. Other agencies and the National Forest Service in particular have many individuals like myself working in the field with the media as a collective term, but by and large, the Park Service in the past has not had the means and perhaps maybe not the vision to reach beyond ourselves. And I would say today that that's changing, and it's an exciting change. You've all heard about budget crunches and everything else, and certainly we're all dealing with those realities, but at the same time, I think it forces us to take a new look at ourselves, look beyond our boundaries, and work with each other. And I think that's where I am very excited to be working with professional filmers and photographers so that hopefully they can help us convey our messages and vice versa. And there's a challenge in that. And that challenge is that perhaps the professional filmmaker or photographer has their own agenda. They're trying to make a cover shot for a magazine. They have an audience that they're trying to hold their attention, and they may not share the entire message we would like to have conveyed. But it's a goal that we need to continually strive towards. Towards that end, then, we need to continue to educate the media as a whole in terms of the journalists so that they can help convey messages as well. And I'd like to read something from the New York Times from last Sunday, which was printed about Glacier National Park, ironically, but just to give you an example of how some of the national media portrays our natural areas and what those millions of people in our country and elsewhere are reading. It was in the travel section written by Andrew Malcolm, and it was a fairly comprehensive piece. But relative to wildlife, Andrew wrote, "Wildlife encounters are, in fact, one of Glacier's major attractions and dangers. Deer, moose, elk, mountain goats, eagles, and rarely gray wolves can be seen or heard. So too can bears, which can be exciting and sometimes fatal. A photographer was killed in Glacier 3 years ago when a mother bear decided he was too close to her cubs. Like muggings in urban parks, such events feed fear and inspire caution. Make lots of noise when hiking, never store food in a tent, avoid dead animals, and don't wear fragrant cosmetics in the woods." And then they go on to talk about if you do encounter a bear. Although it may not be the exact message we would have liked conveyed, all in all, I think there was a balance in that, and it's tough to always get it across. So that's where the ethics of the professional filmer, the photographer, and the rest of the journalistic world, if I can combine things, really come in. I think we need to continually work with the professionals and make sure that they know where our concerns are. With the Park Service in general, there's a lot of discussion about people approaching animals too closely, stressing the animals, the question of the cumulative effect of the stress on those animals and trying to identify what those stresses are, educating ourselves and being knowledgeable naturalists. The question there is then, can we expect our visitors who come from anywhere in this country or elsewhere to have all that kind of background? And I would argue, realistically, when they enter our gates, probably not. So what's the answer? Reaching out to them in advance. And as I spoke to Chuck this morning, it's exciting to see independent efforts such as his to try and address some of those needs, and we need to be working more closely with them. The fact that the Park Service in itself, has limitations, I don't think should be a barrier. I don't think the Park Service has the answers, nor does any other federal agency in terms of enforcing or requiring some kind of an ethic in the individuals, other than to say that we should be trying to inspire some kind of an ethic. We should be educating and trying to communicate our concerns as best we can. And how do we do that? Some of our means are very antiquated. We have wayside exhibits that are 30 and 40 years old. We have films that perhaps tell a lie, an old truth, and they need to be updated. So, we need to continually strive towards that as well.